Okay, we've got 10 minutes. Yes,
Okay, can you start working? I thought that was quite useful, some of the discussions there, because there are a couple of points that were raised that I want to come on to here. I want to really just start with what's happened over the last couple of weeks. I think there is a general sense of shock that's hit across the left. Even the bit of the left that didn't have illusions to the Labour Party has been quite stunned that the Tories getting an absolute majority. No one was predicting this. But there's also been an explosion of anger. I was at a meeting discussing the election results a couple of days ago, and one woman there, very experienced socialist, very experienced trade union rep, said that we have nothing to. There's nothing to do but fight. We're so up against the wall, we have to fight. And I think that sense of anger and militancy is what you've seen fueling the demonstrations in London, the assemblies. There's another anti-austerity demonstration in Cardiff happening today. There was one last week, Bristol as well. So there is this fighting mood, and a refusal to accept. It's filtered in a slightly strange way as an argument about legitimacy, which I don't think is necessarily the right way of looking at it, but it's a refusal to accept that the Conservatives have just won and we should just all, roll over and die and take it. Now, all of this is very positive, and other people have talked about it, and I wanted to start by reminding people of it, because, but I do want to strike a cautionary note, because I think that the right is stronger than many of the analyses that have come out of the left are suggesting. And I know that's a kind of downbeat thing to say, but I want to work through why I think that is the case before moving on very briefly to what we can do about what we can do in the next few months and years. I think the general picture, when you look at what has happened, what is happening in society, is one of polarisation. You could see that happening in the Euro elections last time. In the Euro elections last year, the Lib Dems and Conservatives crashed, and UKIP rose, and to a lesser extent, Labour rose. This time around, the consolidation on the right has happened centred around the Conservative Party. So the right has consolidated its position, and I think that racism and bigotry in general has played a very important part in them doing that. They preyed on people's fears in many ways, and we need to think quite carefully about how to address that. There has also been a polarisation to the left, but it hasn't found any kind of expression on the official political arena, apart from in Scotland, where very spectacularly you've seen people voting for the SNP on anti-austerity grounds. I don't want to get into a complicated argument about the nature of the SNP, but all the polls suggest that Scottish nationalism as a thing has actually been dropping steadily since 1999, since devolution. So I think we need to understand what's happened in Scotland as a left pole of this polarisation looking for some kind of way of expressing itself and coming out that way. Similarly, the Green Party have kind of found themselves positioned in expressing that in England and Wales, despite the history of the Green Party being, and the record in places like Brighton, being very different. So we have this polarisation, but it's skewed. And at the moment, I think at the present moment, we have a shift to the right that is locked in, certainly amongst the kind of political class, the commentariat, the media, a new right-wing common sense, which I think is going to be quite a tough opponent. I just want to kind of rattle through some of the things that happened in the election. I'm sure that everyone here is probably adapted here with reading tables and graphs and election analyses. But the one thing that really struck me throughout that night was that everybody underestimated the scale of the Liberal Democrat collapse. Now, I think what's happened here is that and the other thing about it is if you look at where those Lib Dem votes went, 2/3 of them went to the right and only 1/3 went to the left. So I think what happened here is that the trashing of the Liberal Democrats' reputation, one that they thoroughly deserved, by the way, was so heavy, it actually cut into their core vote. And we then have to think about the fact that the core vote of the Liberal Democrats is actually quite middle class, and on economic issues at least, right wing. So they snapped to the Tories. And so I think the depth of as people talked about the Conservatives sort of feasting off the Lib Dems' corpse to win the election, I think that has a slightly grotesque metaphor, but it's one that captures the dynamics quite a bit. That you had a section of the middle class, people who fancied themselves as having progressive opinions, who tailed Blair and New Labour in '97. By 2008, were mostly voting Liberal Democrat, and now they're going over to the Tories. So what I think has happened is at the top of society, the top 10-20% of society, you're seeing a very, very strong consolidation on the right. And that's going to affect the mainstream media. I mean, we've seen what the BBC's been like in the last year or so. I think there is going to be a kind of common sense on the right from the political class that is going to drown out most alternative voices. So that's a question of hegemony, to use the term that's been bandied about a bit. And our task has to be to construct a kind of counter-hegemony to that. And the question is how do we do that? Now, I just want to look at a couple of examples of what's happened on the right here. Firstly, one of the things that this kind of right-wing common sense being locked in at the top of society has done is it means the ruling class is much more confident and has gone on the offensive. And I think we saw a precursor of that a couple of weeks before the election with the voiding of the election in Tower Hamlets. I live in Tower Hamlets, and people will be aware that there was a left of Labour mayor, Lutfur Rahman, who was basically an electoral court found that he'd been corrupt. And if people might have just sort of seen this in the news, I urge people to actually read the judge's judgment, because the level of kind of, at best patronising, at worst downright racist assumptions that he makes about the Bengali community in Tower Hamlets is quite astonishing. But the fact that they went for this one council that had been making fairly mild reforms, they're by no means, they were making cuts, but they were careful not to do them in educational frontline services. They built a couple of libraries, they restored EMA in Tower Hamlets. These are all things that any Labour council could actually do. But the fact that they made an example of this council in that way, I think, tells you that they felt the wind was in their sails. And of course, Islamophobia was a key element of how they justify that crackdown. And I think this is a common thread, that when the right goes on the attack, the use of racist and other forms of bigotry becomes a kind of the ideological core around which they mobilise. Now, the other aspect of this of the election, of course, is the role of UKIP. Now, I think it's quite important to stress that while UKIP only got one seat, and while Farage failed to get Thanet, and I should say that we should give massive credit to Bunny LaRoche and the Thanet for doing that. And in general, UKIP did underperform their expectations in the south of England, which is traditionally their base. But the vote in the north is very worrying. They came second in 120 seats, and half of them are Labour seats. And what I think has happened here, now there's a lot of question marks about where the UKIP vote is coming from, what have you. I think a slight minority position in this debate, in that I think the UKIP vote is essentially right-wing and is essentially mobilised by racism. Now, there are all sorts of issues that UKIP voters say they're concerned about, but, lots of people are concerned about lots of issues. What is the catnip? What is the one that actually pulls people into voting for UKIP, and rather than just being sympathetic? And that's the bashing of immigrants. And this is why Farage's campaign was extremely nasty, and the stuff about HIV, even the mainstream press was shocked at the sort of stuff he was coming out with. But that was done for a reason, because he knows this stuff is politically incorrect, but it's also the stuff that pulls in a kind of general disengaged and prone to people who are sympathetic to reactionary arguments that they read in the press. This is the one that makes them actually jump and makes them put an X in the UKIP box. And what we saw, there was some thinking earlier, about a year or so ago, that the UKIP vote might split the right-wing vote. But what we actually saw was that the votes that went from the Tories to UKIP were made up for by votes from the Liberal Democrats to the Tories. So actually the Tory vote stayed steady. It's about, I think it rose 0.5%. There's some churn underneath that, and it's a churn moving to the right, which is this kind of polarisation thing that I'm talking about. So what I think has happened in those northern seats is that UKIP has managed to become successful at mobilising a reactionary vote in those areas. It's actually always been around, partly because Labour hasn't been very left-wing in those areas. And there's a section of the Labour voting working class that has always been quite reactionary on race issues and has never actually been challenged about that. And that's the kind of section of the working class and Labour vote that is moving to UKIP. But much more significantly, small businessmen, petty bourgeois elements, former Tories, people who didn't bother voting in these constituencies have now got something to vote for. And I think that's why we're seeing UKIP coming second in so many of these different places. Now, what is Labour going to do about this, if anything? Well, I just want to read to you a tweet I saw earlier today from a speech from Andy Burnham, who people will be aware is the left's candidate in the Labour leadership election. And in this speech he said, "We have no right to be heard. We have no right to have any permission to be heard until we address the immigration question credibly." So even the left candidate in the Labour election is basically sticking by, pledge number 4, control immigration. And I think that gives you an indication of how the sort of disarray that the Labour Party is finding itself in. It's being pulled in a lot of different directions. There's going to be an overwhelming pressure for it to chase a bit of the UKIP vote. I mean, MPs like Sam Danjuk have been openly arguing for this for a little while now. But in other sections, like in London, where there's a large ethnic minority Labour vote, it'll be pulled in the other direction. You're seeing the complete chaos that was mentioned about their reaction in Scotland. I think the Labour Party is shot through with contradictions, and these contradictions are just going to get worse over the next few months. So I don't think we're going to see any kind of revival in Labour coming anytime soon. Now, this doesn't mean to say that everything's going to be plain sailing for the Tories and the right. There are a lot of issues they could screw up on. People have talked about the European referendum, and that's going to become more and more of an issue. I'm not entirely sure what we should be saying about the actual vote. I do think that somebody has to make a principled defence of migrants. We have to say that everybody who is here is going to stay here. Everyone who is here deserves the benefits that everyone else gets. And we also have to argue against Fortress Europe. One of the interesting things at the elections, when there was that terrible tragedy in the Mediterranean, we didn't see, a racist backlash in the press, that actually people were so shocked by what was going on, Clegg and Cameron had to apologise for cutting funding from Mare Nostrum. Now, I think that tells you that there is an untapped section of the population that's absolutely disgusted by the attacks on immigration, whether they come from Europe, as in the Fortress Europe stuff, or from the anti-European right in Britain. If the radical left has one job to do in this election campaign, I think it's to make those arguments as clearly as possible.
Are you winding up there?
Yeah, I'm just going to end up on a couple of things that I think that we can actually do positively over the next few months. There has been a radicalisation amongst young people, and especially young people of colour. I was astonished by the one election the left has managed to win recently, which was in the NUS about a month before the election, where essentially a non-aligned left, organised around the liberation campaigns, in particular the Black Students' campaign, managed to take a great deal of positions in the NUS, and that comes on the top of some very powerful mobilisations around issues like Ferguson and so on, Black Lives Matter in the last few months. And I think that's something that's very positive that we can build on. Obviously, there's going to be resistance. There are going to be appalling attacks on working class communities, and people are going to fight back. But I do want to stress that we're in this for the long haul. It's going to be a long, long time before we manage to actually smash through and break up this.
And I think we need to be thinking now about drawing together the ideas and the concepts that can sustain a movement over the long term. I was thinking back to when we've seen Blair popping his head up and offering his thoughts on the election. And straight away, you see people going, "You lied to us about Iraq." And the hatred for him is still there. And I think it's interesting that after all these years, the fact that the left had an analysis of what was going on 10 years ago in Iraq that turned out to be true, that idea managed to hold together, and it's still there, and it still means that people like Blair aren't taken credibly. So it's a matter of pulling together certain basic ideas against Islamophobia, against the attacks on immigrants, to use a slightly overused word, putting out a narrative that knocks back against this right-wing consensus. That's something that's not going to happen automatically, and I think it's something the radical left has to consciously go ahead and do. And if there is one step that we can make that can help pull together the movement that we need over the next few months, I would suggest it's that. Thank you.
Thank you, Bat. Our next speaker is Burdon-Manley, and she is going to speak about immigration and Fortress Europe. So, Burdon-Manley.
Hi. I'm going to be parting with quite a lot of information here, so I'm going to be reading through my notes quite a lot. So apologies for that. I don't do that very often, but there's a lot to get through. I'm going to start on Fortress Europe, and then I'm going to move on to some of the immigration laws in this country. Okay, here we go. In 2014, 130,000 people crossed Europe's southern borders by sea. The Italian search and rescue operation, Mare Nostrum, saved 150,000 lives during its service at a cost of €9 million a week. This was still not good enough because over 3,000 people died crossing the Mediterranean last year when Mare Nostrum was in operation. The decision was made at European level to phase out the search and rescue operations and replace it with Triton, a border protection operation run by the EU agency Frontex. The difference between the two operations is that Mare Nostrum carried out proactive search and rescue of 27 square miles of the Mediterranean, but Triton only operates border surveillance within 30 miles of the Italian coast on a budget of less than a third of Mare Nostrum. It is expected that the deaths on the Mediterranean will be 10 times higher this year than last year. So there's an estimated death rate of 30,000 people on the Mediterranean this year. Theresa May was among the interior ministers on the Justice and Home Affairs Council responsible for making the reduced service decision. Ministers were well aware of the dangers of pulling search and rescue operations, that the migrant boats were overcrowded and that the migrant boats were unseaworthy. Frontex at the time admitted that they expected more deaths at sea. The General Secretary for the European Council for Refugees said that the numbers of people dying would multiply. The Immigration Minister, James Bhattacharya, defended the position, arguing that search and rescue operations encourage migrants to cross the Mediterranean. On the 15th of April, 400 migrants drowned, and on the 18th of April, over 800 migrants drowned crossing the Mediterranean, the latter being the largest loss of life in a single crossing. Over 800 people have been killed on the Mediterranean this year alone. At the same time, a parallel situation began to unravel in the Aegean, with more than 100 mostly Syrian refugees drowning as they attempted to reach Greece from Turkey. Pulling search and rescue operations was a concerted effort by European leaders to push back migrants. Soon after 800 people died on the Mediterranean, 446 people were rescued by Italy, 142 by Spain, 90 by Greece, and 72 people by Turkey. People are desperate enough to make the journey despite the risks. So this is after the 900 people, the almost 900 people died in the Mediterranean. At the end of last year, Syrian refugees were camped outside the Greek Parliament. Hundreds protested EU immigration laws preventing the free movement of refugees between EU states, the right of passage to other EU countries to be reunited with family members. People on hunger strike symbolically taped their mouths shut and held banners reading, "The government must find a solution for Syrian refugees now. If Syrian refugees apply for asylum in Greece, they'll be prevented from applying for asylum in other EU countries, and the process is long and the success rate is low." Between 2011 and 2014, 46,500 Syrian refugees arrived in Greece. In December 2014, 600 Syrian refugees were rescued off the island of Crete. The Dublin Treaty make asylum seekers the responsibility of the first EU country they enter. Syrian protesters protested for weeks for the right to seek sanctuary in other countries. Many young people want to get on with their studies, look for jobs, which were unattainable in Greece at the time, as most people well know. And children are spending prolonged periods outside of school. In 2013, 150 Syrian refugees crossed the land border between Turkey and Greece at the Evros River, arriving in a village in northeastern Greece. Then white police vans turned up and removed women, men and children, and activists, lawyers and human rights groups weren't able to find out what happened to these groups of people. This was in contravention of international conventions signed by Athens. Coast Guards and police made a concerted effort to push back refugees. So this was happening in Greece, this was happening in Italy. Special Coast Guard units have been accused of dumping migrants in Turkish territorial waters. Migrants have been violently apprehended, faced charges, stripped and their belongings taken, and migrants beaten. The Greek outpost of the UN Refugee Agency voiced concern over the two groups of refugees entering the northeastern region because no one was ever registered with the First Reception Centre as foreseen by national law. Amnesty International urged Greece to launch an inquiry into comments made by the police chief at the time in Greece, in which he actually ordered his officers to make the lives of immigrants unbearable. This is what he said. He said, "If they told me I could go to a country and would be detained for 3 months and would then be free to steal and rob, that would be great. We must make their lives unbearable." The chief police told officers during a secretly recorded meeting. This was the highest security official in Greece after the public order minister. Senior Coast Guard officials were jailed after subjecting an asylum seeker to a mock execution and waterboarding. The land border between Greece and Turkey was sealed in 2012. It's like a barricade with thermal and solar sensors, and it's called the Evros Wall. And just to talk a little bit more about sort of borders, in Spain and North Africa, there's a fence cut into the North African coastline marking Spanish territory, and it's purpose-built to prevent illegal immigration and smuggling. This divides Morocco from Melilla, a Spanish city on the North African coast. The exclave used to be open until about the 1990s, when mass migration from West Africa to Europe took off. Then a 6-metre tall fence with high-tech sensors and razor wire was erected around that exclave. And this is where Fortress Europe begins. It begins in North Africa. Wars do not address underlying causes of conflicts. They seek to mitigate. Wars are an illusion of security. Those on the wrong side work out ways to get around them, as we well know. The Greek government, Syriza, have decided to provide Syrian refugees with travel documents. as soon as possible in order to be able to travel to any European country they want, announced a government spokesperson after a bi-ministerial meeting held with the Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras. The meeting also decided the development of settlements and infrastructure in which migrants would undergo medical examination in order to ensure necessary health and safety standards. So there are improvements being made. Whether that's going far enough, I very much doubt it. I know I've read recently that Syriza still wants it to be the responsibility of Turkey to man their borders and not allow any immigrants into Syria, and that's just not good enough, because these are refugees fleeing war. You've got hundreds of thousands, well, in fact millions. You've got about 3.5 million people surrounding the borders of Syria, and 6.5 million internally displaced people within Syria. And as the man at the back said earlier, we've only taken 143. Germany have agreed to take about 20,000. Again, none of this is good enough. The European Commission has reversed its decision to provide a reduced surveillance service and will now operate a search and rescue service on the Mediterranean at the same cost as Mare Nostrum, because they were wrong, and open a pilot. And this is another thing they'll do. They'll be opening a pilot multi-purpose centre in Niger, a key transit point for migrants entering Europe, run by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, an international organisation for migration. To provide this is what they'll do on the transit route. They're going to provide information on the perils ahead, protection from exploitation, and identify those in need of resettlement, temporary protection, family reunification and other options. The International Organisation for Migration calls for improved legal channels for people seeking work and for asylum seekers. Now that covers Fortress Europe. I'll go really quickly go over some of the new rules within the UK as a result of the Immigration Act 2014. To qualify for free NHS treatment, all migrants from outside the EEC must now have indefinite leave to remain. So we're preventing migrants, irregular migrants, and failed asylum seekers from actually getting treatment in the NHS at the moment. We're breaking up our NHS. This removes GPs' duty of care provision to provide free of charge, immediately necessary and emergency treatment to all overseas visitors. Migrant workers and students on visas longer than 6 months will have to pay a surcharge of about £200. Almost all entrants are required to pay £200 surcharge for visas of 6 months and more for every year of the visa, and they've got to pay up front and in full. And new rules apply to all those extending current visas. Over 30% of NHS staff are migrant workers. Migrant workers pay taxes and contribute to the local economy. The new rules change the definition of ordinary resident to only include those who have indefinite leave to remain. Refugees and asylum seekers are exempt from paying the surcharge, and I do casework in the Welsh Refugee Council, so I know that there are asylum seekers that will fall outside of that because they're failed asylum seekers. Failed asylum seekers, irregular migrants, are probably going to not risk going to their local hospital, going to their local GP. Because they're going to the hospitals, the NHS are now required to share information between government departments and with the Home Office. The Department of Health issued